Welcome to today's PACE webinar sponsored by Gryphon Networks, Call Recording for Compliance in 2015. My name is Chris Herrick, and I am the SVP at PACE, and I will be your moderator for today. Before we begin, I would like to review just a couple of housekeeping items with you. First of all, your phones are muted today to avoid any unnecessary background noise. We will have a Q&A session the last 10 to 15 minutes of the webinar. So to submit your questions, please type it in the chat box on the bottom left of your screen, and we will get to as many of those questions as possible. The slides will be made available to you after the webinar is over, and this webinar is also being recorded. So without further ado, please allow me to introduce our wonderful speakers that we have for you today. First of all, we have Melissa Bateman-Fitzgerald, and Melissa heads up Gryphon's privacy consulting practice, and for the past decade has delivered counsel to some of the largest U.S. and global financial institutions and corporations. Ms. Fitzgerald has extensive experience providing privacy consultation and is considered a thought leader in all marketing, privacy, and teleservices matters. Ms. Fitzgerald is regularly asked to speak on and contribute to industry panels, including the Direct Marketing Association, International Association for Privacy Professionals, and PACE. Prior to her tenure at Gryphon, Ms. Fitzgerald was employed as Manager and Legal Counsel of the Global Privacy Office of Monster Worldwide. Ms. Fitzgerald is a Certified Information Privacy Professional and a Certified PACE SRO Auditor. Attorney Fitzgerald earned her law degree from Suffolk University of Law, graduated from the Eagleton Institute of Politics, and earned a degree in political science from Rutgers College at Rutgers University. Now let's talk about Eric Espenian. As Senior Vice President of Sales and Marketing, Eric leads Gryphon's sales, business development, and marketing teams. He brings over 17 years of experience with performance optimization and business intelligence software. He is charged with driving growth of Gryphon's global client base with cloud-based sales intelligence and marketing preference solutions that drive effectiveness and revenue for large distributed sales organizations. He joined Gryphon from PowerPhone Inc., an innovative crisis management software firm for municipal and military safety organizations. During his tenure as head of sales and marketing, he led a complete company repositioning and sales re-engineering initiative that resulted in back-to-back record revenue and profit while establishing a market leadership position for newly patented call handling application. Previously, Eric has also held sales leadership roles with MicroStrategy, a leader in business intelligence software, as well as Hewlett-Packard and EMC Corp. He has earned an MBA from F.W. Olin School of Business at Babson College and a BA from Boston College. And with that, I will turn the panel over to Melissa and Eric.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it. And, really, I don't know if there's anything more to tell. That background was clearly comprehensive, and thank you very much. Well, folks, I'm very happy to have you attend this webinar talking about call recording for compliance in 2015. Hopefully, it'll be time well spent, and I think that if nothing else, you'll get some good insight into the landscape and what clients and customers are doing around applying call recording to ensure regulatory compliance in this day and age. And I don't need to tell the folks on the phone. It looks like a lot of you folks have a compliance background. But I think in a nutshell, the regulatory environment is getting more and more difficult to navigate than ever before with the introduction of new regulatory bodies, as well as the spike in lawsuits and class actions and the increased vocality of customers themselves to reward vendors that adhere to their preference standards and punish the ones that don't. It's very difficult to navigate those waters in the environment that we're currently in. There's a lot more ambiguity to what the law is and what is the right course of action in order to limit your liability. From a solicitation standpoint, from a collection standpoint, anything you're doing over the telephone is a potential liability risk. So what we're seeing is a lot more of a focus around applying call recording to defray some of that risk and defray some of that liability in order to improve oversight of your operation. So I'm going to turn it over to Melissa now, who's going to speak a little bit about that landscape in detail.
Sure. Thank you, Eric. I was kind of mocking that we have a webinar for compliance around call recording, in the sense that really everything that needs call recording today can't really be put into one slide, and it can't be put into one webinar. But I appreciate that the folks on the line are compliance-based, and they're struggling, and they're dealing with how do you comply with all of these call recording requirements, or deal with compliance that is happening on the phone, and how do you have insight into what your agents or your employees are doing on the phone. So we're really going to just touch on some of those laws and what our compliance folks are struggling with, and trying to talk through how do you necessarily comply with a requirement that says you can't have employees that harass consumers. Well, how do you know what they're doing on the phone? And how do you know, they're not adhering to your scripts that you've written for them, or they're not following business policies and procedures? So really what we're talking about here is a broader issue, in the sense that you really do need insight into what all of your employees and agents and vendors are doing on your behalf when they're speaking to consumers. The consumer landscape is changing. Since the financial crisis of 2008, we're seeing far more oversight into how businesses interact with consumers. And really the biggest change is that now consumers have a voice. The right of privacy, the right of consumer protection is far more widespread than we've ever seen before, and we only foresee that it's going to double over time and triple and quadruple. So the point being is that call recording is a solution that you can have insight into what all of your employees, all of your vendors, all of your agents that are calling on behalf of your organization, you have insight into what they're doing, and you have enforceable data. As many as you know, that there's many regulations today that actually strictly say that you need to call record, and those are the CFPB's regulations under Dodd-Frank, the FTC's telemarketing sales rule, and the FTC's TCPA. As many of you know, the TCPA class action suits have exponentially come out over the last several years, particularly the class action suits around debt collection. So we foresee that that's going to continue to happen. The courts are really split on how to enforce TCPA, so the FCC has been tasked with clarifying many of their regulations. So we only foresee that issues around TCPA, what happens on the phone, is going to become much more trickier and difficult to navigate. So thank you. On to the next slide. So to talk a little bit about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB's requirement for call recording. After the financial crisis of 2008, we had the Dodd-Frank statute, which was passed. It was over 2,000 pages of statute regulating how financial institutions can interact with consumers. The primary purpose of the CFPB was to become a regulatory agency to protect consumers with regards to financial transactions, particularly around lending institutions. So this really impacts lenders, mortgage companies, credit cards, student loans, anybody that lends money. The CFPB's primary purpose, though, is to restrict unfair, deceptive, or abusive acts or practices. This really makes sure that the consumer has the right to enforce the laws against anyone that would be deceptive or unfair or have any sort of abusive act on the telephone, particularly. So, for example, if you had a debt collector that was misleading the consumer as to how much money they owed, or misleading them with regards to the penalties of non-payment. So what we are seeing is that debt collectors and anybody that works on behalf of debt collectors is now falling underneath the regulatory arm of the CFPB. It's a very, very wide net. It's very broad enforcement. It really impacts anybody that would be a service provider or under a financial institution or a lending institution. That means that anybody that would support a lending institution in any way could fall underneath the regulatory arm of the CFPB. That means then that you need audit procedures for everybody that could work on your behalf if you're being regulated under the CFPB. So you need methodologies to hold all your vendors and all of your employees and all of your agents accountable for what they're saying and how they interact with consumers. Another area of compliance that call recording is imperative for is telemarketing compliance. It's been longstanding that there are certain disclosure requirements, particularly under the FTC's TSR, and I'm often asked what we're going to see that's going to change under the telemarketing rules and regulations. With the TCPA change in October of 2013, and the huge increase under the TCPA's class action suits, many people are looking to the future and saying, well, what's going to change in the future? Really what we're seeing right now is that the FTC is potentially going to be editing its TSR. In July of 2014, it opened itself up for public comments on pre-acquired account information. As many of you know, pre-acquired account information requires consent, and that consent needs to be captured in an appropriate method. There are other regulations, the Restore Online Shoppers Confidence Act, that also requires consent to be captured in order for payment card networks to transfer the information to third parties. What we're going to probably see soon is that the FTC is going to harmonize their rules with the Restore Online Shoppers Confidence Act. So we do foresee that there is going to be significant changes with regards to consent requirements under the pre-acquired account information. In addition to that, under telemarketing compliance, you really need to make sure that all of your agents and your employees are adhering to scripts. I often hear people struggling with that rogue agent that says, I appreciate that you have written these policies and procedures for me. I see that you have a script, but that's not going to get my deal closed. So how do you ensure that all of your agents are complying and following your scripts? You really need insight into what they're saying on the phone. In addition to that, obviously, many telemarketing laws are out there that have disclosure requirements just around you must be 18, or if someone says, I don't want to talk to you, then you need to get off the phone, so no rebuttal or permission to continue. How do you ensure that your agents are adhering to those no rebuttal states or those disclosure requirements around you must be 18? As I mentioned, the capturing of consent is imperative for a number of regulations, particularly around Regulation E, pre-acquired account information, or negative option marketing. In order to comply with the Federal e-Sign Act, if you capture consent over the phone, it needs to be recorded, and it needs to be retained for the duration of that consent. Additionally, it's always good to have is the capturing of consumer preferences, whether that be consent or whether that be an opt-out. If someone says, I opted out in 2010, and you have a call recording with the consumer in which they're gladly speaking with the telemarketer and then say, you know what, I'm going to opt out and it's 2014, that's great evidence should there ever be an investigation or an inquiry into your telemarketing practice. In addition, also, there's always prize promotions, and that law really does vary, but a number of prize promotion regulations out there do require call recording to ensure that you have properly disclosed the rules and regulations around the prize promotion.
Thank you, Melissa. So I think taking a step back, you realize that the trend is on continuing regulatory restrictions, more laws, more statutes, more regulations, in an increasingly hostile environment to operate when you're talking to consumers via the telephone, email, any channel, really. And every time there's a new law on the books or a strengthening of a law, the prospect universe that you have to contact or the people who you can legally get in touch with gets smaller and smaller, whereas the need to grow revenue and grow your business is relentless, and it continues to go up. So this environment is really what you're faced with today, and there are ways that you can apply tools in a strategic way, not just throwing hardware at an issue and hoping for the best, but really to be strategic with using technology, using capabilities sparingly in order to reduce, not only the risk and liability of fines, but also of brand damage. We have a good number of our clients who are more concerned about damage to their brand by rogue agents or third parties that market on their behalf, even more so than accruing fines from the regulatory bodies, because brand damage has lasting impact. This is actually a posting from Facebook that one of Gryphon's partners gave us when they were made aware that some of their third-party vendors were calling people, as the slide indicates, 11, 12 times within a couple days. Really just bad practices from a bad actor. This individual who posted this on Facebook, maybe they didn't have a big following, but if that happens to an athlete or a celebrity and that type of word gets out onto Twitter or Facebook or you name it, the brand is going to suffer some big damage, and that can be quantified in the tens of millions of dollars, whereas a fine may just be $1 or $2 million.
And had this been a financial institution, this would be a violation under the CFPB, and they would be actually held in penalization and require significant regulatory fines.
Exactly. So there's a lot of advantages to being able to get your arms around the activity of your agents and your marketers, but that's easier said than done. The contact centers these days don't as often look like this. More and more clients are pushing the marketing down into the localities, into the branches to build that one-to-one relationship with their clients. In this environment, in this world, it's fairly easy to manage, monitor, and track the activities, whether it's the audio conversations or call patterns, et cetera, because they're all calling through a single homogeneous system, and you have supervisors and managers to oversee it on a day-to-day basis. Unfortunately, though, more and more organizations are moving their people into a distributed environment, whether it's remote offices, field personnel, home offices. Not only are contact center employees getting spread out, but even people who would be considered contact center employees, the definition is changing because more and more conversations are happening in the branches, in the field, not in places that would be traditionally called a contact center. So to compound the regulatory challenges, there's also operational challenges where you have economies of scale to distribute personnel, many of them, many cost savings, et cetera, but the additional risk incurred, and that's multiplied by the fact that these folks are now not under the control of a centralized system and centralized management. The cloud, you've heard a ton about the cloud, and it can be secure, but it also compounds the risk because now you can have people who represent your company, who talk to your customers, who are working from their own personal cell phone or from their home offices. There's a great deal of independence and flexibility there, but from a compliance standpoint, there's a tremendous amount of risk of people doing the wrong things, or even worse than that, management not really knowing what's going on out there until it's too late. So I think from a visibility standpoint, in a centralized environment, you have a Lumbergh walking up and down the aisles, monitoring every interaction. So you have a lot of visibility, but when you distribute your staff, you distribute the tools that they use to communicate to customers, management has a huge visibility gap that we believe recording can help address. So we won't go into great detail on the value of call recording in its own right. I mean, it's been a well-entrenched technology in the call center for many, many years. $1.2 billion, I think, is the average annual spend on call recording analytics within a traditional call center. But again, the traditional call center is something that's being redefined as we speak. Because it's been an on-premise solution, you haven't been able to get that level of visibility of the qualitative interactions, if you will, for agents that don't happen to sit in that call center. And when you deploy the tool, you deploy it for everybody in the building, and the people who are outside that building, you don't have a tool for them, and you got to just hope for the best. Technology in the cloud has now enabled you to theoretically deploy recording to any rep who makes even a fraction of their phone calls from anywhere on any conceivable device. So there's a lot now where you can defray that risk by being able to deploy recording to what we call the edge, which is the distributed and field-based sales personnel. And as Melissa indicated, the regulations are beginning to now enforce recording of calls, and a lot of times these calls, especially with the Frank-Dodd Act, aren't happening within a call center because they're happening from brokers or agents that are never in the office. They're always in the field, or they're calling from cell phones. So that compounds the issue quite a bit.
Yeah, and I think, I can speak for most compliance officers out there that's something that keeps you up at night, is that how do you enforce call recording on employees that aren't, between the four walls of your organization, and particularly when you also have independent agents that may be potentially calling on your behalf. It's having something which you can implement in any tool, any device across the board, and ensuring that every recording happens as the way it should, because should you not have recording under the Dodd-Frank, for example, for swap transactions, if you don't have that recording, the transaction cannot occur. So with this absence, you know that there is a non-compliance right then and there. So this really, what we're talking about here is we're enabling call recording for anyone, anywhere, in order to be in compliance with Dodd-Frank and particularly the CFPB as well, with regards to knowing if there's harassment or if you're knowing that there's any sort of deception that's occurring on the phone. How do you do that, and how do you make sure that it happens to all of your employees, whether they be in the house? That's where Eric's going to take it from here.
Sure. And, call recording on its own, there is value, especially for that audit trail. But when you record phone calls, the next best thing to do is to really use analytics to identify patterns and things that are happening on those phone calls that you as a manager and you as a compliance officer want to stay on top of. Not necessarily sifting through 400 phone conversations that were recorded, but being made aware and alerted using analytics of situations that may present a compliance risk, or script adherence violations, or not taking disclosures properly, or not adhering to an IDNC. Analytics, when used in conjunction with recording, opens up a whole new world of being able to manage and reduce that risk. If you look at it this way, you have the quantitative and the qualitative benefits here. With on the one hand side, you have an audit trail of the phone call, when it was dialed, who was it dialed from, who was it dialed to, what was the status of that number at that point in time, was it on a do not call list or was it a curfew violation? All those things are going to help you manage that risk. How long did the call last? What was the follow-up? What was the next action? What campaign was that call associated with? And all the summary information quantitatively. With call recording, now you're getting into what happened on that phone call. Did the rep properly represent the brand? Did they adhere to the script or the segment of the script that was required of them? Were there any unusual periods of silence or heightened sense of emotion? You can define alerts and triggers that you are made aware of when they occur, not 3 weeks later after a QA exercise, but the next morning when you can still actually have influence over the eventual outcome. And the goal here is benchmarking behaviors and then measuring to those behaviors.
I think it's imperative at this point to point out that you can utilize, let's say, a list scrubber and then load those numbers into a dialer, and then you have visibility into potentially the numbers that are called and the agent that potentially places the call. But when you're in that path of that call, how do you ensure that you are also adhering to the same compliance when someone is outside of your call center? Being in the path of the call then also enables you then to have more visibility into exactly what the call placed, instead of just having a list scrubber who you could send these numbers off to someone that's outside of your four walls of your call center and say, here's a list of phone numbers that you may call. Once you're in the path of the call, now you actually have visibility into, did they actually place that call? What happened while you were on that call? What were they saying when they were on the call? Were they utilizing certain phrases, terminology that they were or were not supposed to be using? Were they deceiving the consumer? And how would the consumer react when they heard certain terminology? All of that information is very rich, and it's very helpful with regards to building your compliance policies and procedures, because you know what's working and what's not working. You know what's helping consumers feel like they're having a good interaction, and you know what's happening when consumers are complaining and actually following up and saying, I was harassed on this phone call. You know exactly what was said, so then you can then build the policies and procedures based off of what didn't work.
So looking at what recording can do for you from a compliance standpoint, I think we boiled it down to really three key areas. One, the audit trail of conversational interactions. I think at this point in 2015, it's absolutely imperative. The regulators, the lawyers it's no longer an excuse to say we don't have the ability to record calls because they don't sit in a call center. Because technology does exist where you can do that. So really, your defense has to take on a different tack because that's no longer the case. Number two, you need to be able to use recording to smoke out risky behavior early. Identifying bad actors early in their training cycle, not after they've been abusing your brand and causing heartache to customers and complaints for 2 years. Recording is, especially if they're not in a call center, recording is really one of the only ways to smoke out and root out that behavior. And then third, for internal compliance and quality, being able to measure, set a standard internally of how your people communicate to customers and prospects, and then ensuring that standard is at least met and hopefully measuring to continuous improvement over time. So getting into a little more detail on this, the audit trail, it's pretty clear. The law says as a marketer, you're guilty until you're proven innocent. You have to be able to provide a track record of capturing and taking serious compliance, or else you're going to be considered guilty. And having that audit trail is one of the biggest challenges we see from our clients. They need to have that in a 4,000, 5,000 rep scenario where they're all calling from different places. It's very difficult to get that call detail record, so you're guilty until you can prove that, or else, you're up the creek.
Yeah, and I think anyone that's ever dealt with a government agency knows how they typically operate. They're not going to look into whether or not you as an organization violated a regulation. They're just going to slap you with a letter that says that it's come to our attention that you have, and here's the fine. The burden is always going to be on the marketer or the debt collector to defend him or herself as to why a call was placed, and if the call was placed at all. I mean, I can always give the story of a client of ours that was a very large financial institution, very reputable, who was slapped with a multi-million-dollar lawsuit, and it was said, you called several numbers that were on a do-not-call list, and, we're going to hold you liable. Within 10 minutes, I was able to say these numbers weren't even on a do-not-call list. So anyone that's ever dealt with a government agency knows that they're not going to dot all their I's and cross all their T's. They're going to find you guilty until you say otherwise. So having that burden on you as a compliance officer is quite significant, and you need to have the data, and the data is very rich to defend yourself and to stop a PR nightmare right in its tracks.
Number 2, risky behavior, consent, harassment. On those phone conversations that your folks are having with customers and prospects, a lot of stuff is happening. And recording the call is the only way that's going to allow you to know what's happening without sitting over or barging in on every meaningful conversation that you possibly can. And how do you know if it's meaningful or not? Call recording is going to allow you to identify patterns, allow you to identify certain phrases or words that may be used that are hot buttons. So like a guarantee within financial services is something that you may want to be on top of because you don't want your agents guaranteeing anything to anybody. If ever a customer calls 3 years after a deal is done and they say, my broker promised a 30% return in 3 years, if you don't have an audio record of that conversation, you're never going to know whether your rep did anything wrong or right. So with call recording, you can actually, even if it's just a transcript, you can find out what happened on that phone call, and you can actually go back to that customer or their lawyer with actual quantifiable information that'll stop that inquiry, that questioning dead in its tracks. The idea of implied consent with consent around deals or consent around marketing contacts. There's a lot of ambiguity when you have one person's word against another person's word. That's why recording exists. We're saying put it outside the call center where the majority of those conversations are taking place, but do it in a cost-effective and economical way because now you're able to hedge your bets, you identify your bad actors, as we say, and you can root them out and establish a process that's well communicated and well understood.
Perfect example is if you want to utilize an established business relationship based on an inquiry, and that inquiry occurs on the phone. May I call you back, to give you more information about this application you completed? When the person says yes, it's your word against theirs if you don't have an actual recording of that conversation. And if as many of you know, that within states and the federal regulators, they're enforcing these laws more and more every day. And so if the number's on a do not call list and you want to call them, you need to have evidence to provide should you want to override that do not call block.
And third, internal compliance and quality. And this gets back to what we were referring to before, the brand protection. By ensuring that everybody who talks to all of your customers, whether they're captive employees or whether they're third parties that call on your behalf, these folks, if the customer thinks they're talking to your company, they're talking to your company from a liability standpoint. You are on the hook. So it's very difficult to put all these folks who are calling your customers into an office and run all the calling through them. It just doesn't make any sense anymore for a million reasons. However, they are representing your brand. You need to exert some level of control over what they're saying, to whom, and how, in order to preserve that brand that you work so hard to build up. Making sure they're adhering to the scripts that you set out for them. Making sure that you're on top of patterns of behavior, both good and bad, to recognize patterns that you can then use to improve and optimize your operation, regardless of whether they're a 1099 or a captive employee. And the overall goal is to set some benchmarks that everybody understands and ultimately maintain and improve a quality of service while also preserving the flexibility to have people representing you who don't live and sit in one office all the time. So that's a lot of stuff, and it's a lot to take in. And obviously, there are usually costs for call recording any way you do it, whether it's premise or cloud, you name it. But the real value here is that compliance is the tip of the iceberg when it comes to call recording, because there's a lot that you can do with those recordings after you capture them that can help drive the effectiveness of the organization too. We talked about pattern recognition. You can also use analytics to smoke out training issues, bad practices, lead management, distribution of leads, and who actually gets the desired outcomes and who doesn't, identifying success criteria. All these things are also possible almost as a byproduct to maintaining the level of compliance that you need to in this day and age. So we talked about the cloud compounding the risk. You know, the other side of the coin is the cloud also compounds the reward. So you can have an environment where it's a highly decentralized, 21st century, bring your own device, mobile world, but you can centralize rules, you can centralize your operational practices, and you can centralize enforcement using a secure cloud environment. Rather than having limited visibility or almost no visibility to the field, you can actually improve your visibility across the board to everybody who markets on your behalf, no matter where they are, and no matter from what device they may be making their emails or calls, etc. So the idea of bringing these established call center tools to anybody who's calling on your behalf from anywhere is really the benefit of the cloud environment. And at this point, I don't think there's any reason to fight the trend. You know, people want to work wherever they happen to be. And you as compliance executives need to get your arms around that reality and support it in a way that doesn't compromise in introducing more risk and liability to your company. So you start looking at the payoff of deploying call recording and analytics to every rep calling from anywhere. You're going to get the protection from the fines. You're going to get the protection from the lawsuits. You're going to get the auditability, but you're also going to get better effectiveness. You're going to give the sales folks the tools to manage better, to hire better, to train better, to retain better, all done along with maintaining the level of compliance. And why that's important, at least from my client's standpoint, is because now sales can help be part of the process and help fund our recording initiative. So it's not just on compliance to go find the money to do this. It's a combination between compliance and the sales organization, both getting exactly what you're looking for. So you're getting a culture of compliance, as we say, we call it the 4 E's, establishing clear processes, building in enforcement mechanisms to make sure everyone is singing from the same sheet of music, continually evaluating and updating your policies based on changes in the law, in the regulations, and your own internal goals and objectives. And then the 4th E is making sure that every employee has a clear understanding of what your policies are, as well as an understanding that they must follow those standards when they represent your company and they're being paid. And then the other piece of this is, at the end of the day, improving your relationships with your customers, calling people and talking to them in a way they want about the products and services they desire by the channel or marketing method that they actually ask you to call them on. Better client retention, train staff in a much shorter time frame, saving a lot of costs, and ultimately increase the revenue while you're reducing the liability, reducing the risk that's in play here. So with that, I will open it up for questions.
Thanks. Okay, I'll remind everybody that because your phones are muted, if you have questions, please do type them in the lower left-hand box of the chat, and we will take them as they come in. I do have a couple that have come in that I want to go ahead and ask you, Eric and Melissa. The first one that we have is outside the call center. I would imagine that consent would have to be obtained beforehand. So in a branch-type environment, do customers have objections to being recorded by their account rep?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we do get it from time to time because I think everyone is conditioned now to understand when they're getting calls, they're on a phone with Verizon Wireless in a call center in South Carolina, that the call is going to be recorded. There's always proper disclosures, but when you're getting a call from your local banker or you're getting a call from your insurance agent, generally there's a reluctance to introduce the disclosure. There are 12 states that require all-party consent, so if you're calling into or from one of those states, you do need to obtain consent, and that's a concern about customers choosing to not be recorded. Practically speaking, what we find is that customers are more inclined to accept recording almost as a cost of doing business these days because they see it as an opportunity to get an audit record of the conversation for their own purposes. So if ever there is a dispute, they know that call was recorded. And these days, I don't think anybody's too surprised when it's made aware that they're recording. And once they know why they're recording, to improve quality, to improve compliance, it makes the customers generally more receptive and actually happier that they are being recorded than the conventional wisdom, which would be, well, gosh, my folks are going to be upset because now I'm recording their conversations when before I wasn't. It is an issue, but it's something that's I think a far bigger concern before you start testing the market and before you deploy than when you actually get into the actual deployment itself.
And I think it's important to note that with privacy laws becoming more profound, that consumers do feel as though they have a right to privacy, and they do want more privacy, and they don't want every step that they take to be recorded or to be tracked. But that being said, when you disclose to them and you say that the reason we are recording is because we're here for consumer protection, I think many times they are much more amenable to that recording. But certainly having the ability to turn off the recording is also a key factor in order for your agents to remain in compliance with the federal and state wiretapping laws.
Yeah, not only turning off the recording, but having an audit trail of the agent turning off recording so that also is part of the record.
Very good. The next question comes in. It says, what are the implications of international consumer care, i.e. to Canada?
I'm sorry, repeat the first part of that question. What are the implications?
Yep, of international consumer care.
Sure. There are I would say wiretapping laws, but probably more likely privacy laws are much more stringent with regards to recording outside of the U.S. The U.S. is really one of the few countries that still doesn't have a sweeping data privacy law. So places like Canada do have a data privacy law, TIPIDA, that does prohibit the recording of consumers without consent. But very similarly as we see in the U.S., how you get around that is, one, you need to capture consent of all of your employees prior to implementing call recording campaigns. Whether that be through an HR policy or actually having a conversation with each of your employees and telling them why you're recording and capturing their consent, then you must obtain consent of all of your employees prior to starting any call recording implementation. That being said, in the U.S., you only have to capture the called party's consent in 12 states. Those 12 states are what Eric referred to as the all-party consent states. Based on wiretapping laws, you must obtain consent of all called parties in an all-parties consent state. In Canada, you cannot record without consent of anybody. So that means having the consent of the employee as well as obtaining consent from every consumer in which you call in Canada. So it's a little cumbersome, but at least it's a little more uniform. So that anytime you call a Canadian phone number, you must disclose that this call is being recorded. So that brings up another great point: is when we say consent, the courts have been very clear about this. That when you say that the call is being recorded and the consumer chooses to continue the conversation and not hang up, then that means that they have given you consent. It's also been proven that by courts that if you hear a beeping on the phone, and the consumer should be aware that that is a recording, that if they continue that phone call, that's true is also implied consent. So hearing that tone and continuing that conversation is considered implied consent, as well as continuing a conversation after a disclosure that the call is being recorded is also considered implied consent. And that has all been found to be okay under privacy laws and wiretapping laws.
Interesting. I just learned something, so thank you for that, Melissa.
Sure.
The next question that we have is kind of a two-parter. So does the TSR or TCPA require recording of the entire conversation, not just the verification of a sale, which includes a credit card payment? And then to that point, in his interpretation, it is required, but I'm unclear of the free-to-pay part of the language of the law.
So to answer the first part of your question, no, there is no requirement under, as of today, under the TSR or the TCPA to record the entire conversation. It's really more around the credit card approval and giving the authorization. And the second part of that question was the free to pay. Could you repeat that part of the question?
Sure, absolutely. He says the second part, in his interpretation, it is required, but I'm unclear on the free-to-pay part of the language of the law.
I'm not sure I understand that question. They're looking for clarification on whether or not call recording is required. It is required for any time that you are obtaining account information to complete a purchase. And whether that be a negative option marketing scheme or pre-acquired account information being transferred to a third party, you must have a full recording of the approval and an approval to that particular transfer with regards to pre-acquired account information.
Okay. The next question we have, what is the general rule for when the call recording should be stated? The requirement is at the onset of the call, but does that mean prior to any pleasantries or within 30 seconds and prior to any account discussion?
Yeah, that's a common question. It's usually the standard, and it's not, a clear defined standard. It's not as though that, any regulatory body has come out and said this is how it should be. I guess it's important to note here, too, remember these laws are not based off of regulations. These laws are based off, actually, of criminal law in the U.S., so it's wiretapping laws. So there's really no this is how you need to obtain consent type of regulation like you would under the FTC or the FCC's regulations. Particularly around consumers' interactions, of course, the pleasantry is fine if you want to say, hello, my name is, and I'm calling on behalf of. That's the most important part of the conversation, so they know why their call is actually being recorded and who they're talking with. So once those pleasantries are introduced, it typically would happen thereafter, immediately, before you get into the heart of the call.
Okay, this is a follow-up, Melissa, to something that you just said a question or two ago. Can you provide the case law regarding the tone or beep being sufficient as notice the call is being recorded?
Sure, not off the top of my head. I certainly can follow up with whoever asked.
Our email addresses are on the slide right now, so feel free, anybody. And we had a tremendous turnout today, so anybody, please feel free to reach out. We'd be happy to talk to any of you about this in further detail.
Sure.
Okay,
the case law was actually several years ago, so certainly not fresh on my mind at this moment. But
I understand that. The last question that I have right now, unless something else comes in as we're talking about this question, how long are you allowed to store call recordings?
The privacy standard, the industry standard, if you will, is you may retain it for as long as it's necessary for the purpose in which it was collected. So what that purpose may be, if it's consent for the length of your relationship with the consumer. If it is an opt-out, certainly you want to make sure that you're maintaining it for the length of the opt-out, whether that be 5 years, 10 years at the state level. So really, you can't keep it forever. That's privacy discipline that every privacy officer is aware of. You can't keep information forever, but you can keep it for as long as necessary for the business purpose in which it was collected.
All right, fantastic. Well, I would like to thank Melissa and Eric for your great insights today. It was fantastic. We appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to provide us this information today. Again, everybody will be getting a copy of the slides, and also this webinar, the recordings and the slides will be available on the PACE website. I thank everybody for their time today, and I wish you a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.